My name is Edna Parker. On that spring morning in Boston, I was about to live through a moment that, for most of my life, had only existed in the improbable realm of dreams. I was 26 years old, the daughter of a cleaning lady who scrubbed medical offices by day and sewed clothes by night, and a mechanic whose hands gave out before the day was done. I grew up in a cramped house in Dorchester, where the sound of trains rattling by just blocks away was constant, and the smell of grease and bleach hung thick in the air, a permanent stamp of my childhood. Graduation from Harvard wasn't just a diploma, it was a break from every statistic that had promised me a limited life. I woke up before my alarm. My eyes were already open as the soft morning light filtered through the blinds of my small student apartment. My heart beat faster than usual, not out of anxiety, but from an emotion I hadn't yet named. I walked over to the chair where my graduation gown hung. My mother had sewn it herself, using fabric from an old blanket she had once received as a gift from an employer. She insisted on embroidering my name in tiny gold thread along the inner collar. When I put the gown on, it wasn't just the weight of fabric I felt, it was the weight of my entire history on my shoulders. My mother was already in the living room, her eyes glistening. She wore a simple blue dress she had altered herself for the occasion. When she saw me, she brought a hand to her mouth, as if trying to contain something far greater than herself. "You look beautiful, my daughter," she said, voice cracking. "Your father would be so proud." I nodded but couldn't respond. The silence between us said more than any words could. She reached for my hand and held it tight, the way she always did when she wanted to pass her strength to me. As we stepped outside, the Boston sky framed the day perfectly. The Harvard campus buzzed with life, families, graduates, photographers moving in a steady rhythm of celebration. Laughter, footsteps, and the clicking of camera shutters echoed through the walkways like a chorus of resistance and achievement. I sat beside classmates I had shared sleepless nights with, people I had fought off breakdowns with in freezing libraries. Despite the festive air, something felt different about that day. It wasn't just the fulfillment of a collective dream. It was personal. The stage stood ahead, draped in crimson and gold, a symbol of an institution I never thought I would touch, let alone graduate from. Professors lined the edges, some smiling, some unreadable. I could hear names being called, one by one, followed by the polite applause of the crowd. My hands were damp with anticipation, and I clutched my program booklet as if it could anchor me. I glanced at my mother, her eyes never left me, full of pride and something deeper, something sacred. In those moments, I wasn't just a student. I was every version of myself that had ever existed, the girl who studied with reused notebooks, the teenager who waited tables until 2 in the morning, the daughter who held a cold compress to her mother's forehead after chemo. I was the sum of years no one had seen, work no one had witnessed. Today, I would walk across that stage not just for me, but for them, for her. The ceremony moved forward, name after name. The wind gently lifted the tassel on my cap. I wasn't nervous, not really. I was in awe. Every breath I took felt surreal. And yet, I didn't know that something was coming, something that would not just mark the end of a difficult chapter but open a door I never even knew existed. I was about to be called. The moment they called my name, something strange happened. "Edna Parker," the announcer said clearly through the speakers. My ears caught the sound first, but my body felt it right after. The music stopped. That familiar, ceremonial tune that had been playing in the background since the start of the ceremony suddenly cut off in mid-note. It didn't fade. It didn't stutter. It just stopped, abrupt, unnatural. At first, I thought it was a technical glitch. I hesitated for a beat, then smiled awkwardly and stood up. The applause that usually followed each name was slower to come, scattered, unsure. I walked toward the stage with my chin up and my heart pounding in my ears. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, but they weren't the usual congratulatory stares. These were sharper, curious, expectant. Something was wrong, and I didn't know what. As I climbed the steps to the stage, I looked ahead to the university director, Dean Gregory Langston. A man known for his warm smile and proud handshakes during graduation. But he wasn't smiling now. He stood near the microphone, arms behind his back, his expression tight and unreadable. That look made my stomach twist. I stepped forward, expecting to take my diploma like everyone else had, but the dean made no move to hand me anything. Instead, he raised one hand subtly, stopping me in place. The murmurs in the audience grew louder. I turned slightly, trying to see my mother in the crowd, but the lights made it hard. All I caught was a sea of blurred faces. Dean Langston stepped forward. The microphone picked up the soft sound of him clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but unusually firm, "before we continue with the ceremony, there's something important that needs to be said." My hands began to tremble. "Something," he continued, "about Edna Parker that everyone in this room deserves to hear." Gasps rippled through the auditorium. A chill crawled up my spine. This couldn't be happening. Was I in trouble? Was this some kind of mistake? I blinked rapidly, trying to read the dean's face, but he gave me nothing. I stood there, exposed, my mind spinning with possibilities I didn't want to name. The silence was so complete it was almost loud. The only sound was my own shallow breathing. The dean paused, letting the tension rise like a storm about to break. Then, slowly, deliberately, he said, "Edna Parker will not be receiving a diploma today, because starting this fall, she will return to Harvard, not as a student, but as a faculty member." A jolt ran through the audience. People turned to each other in confusion. My jaw dropped. My ears rang. I thought maybe I had misheard him. "She has been appointed as the new assistant professor of modern history," he continued. "Effective immediately." Then came the explosion. Voices overlapped, murmurs turned to shocked exclamations. I stared at him, frozen. My legs wouldn't move. I had no words, no understanding. I turned again, scanning the crowd for my mother, and that's when I saw it. Her head tilted back, her arms slack, and then she fell forward into the lap of the woman beside her. She had fainted. The scene shattered into motion. People rushed toward her. I tried to jump down from the stage, but someone held me back. Dean Langston said something to me, but I couldn't hear. All I knew was that my mother, my anchor, had fallen, and I wasn't beside her. The applause began, but I couldn't feel it. I'll wait for your feedback before continuing with part 3, the unbelievable announcement. Let me know if you'd like to proceed. Time didn't just slow, it fractured. I stood on that stage as if inside a glass dome, sealed off from the noise, from the crowd, from the chaos below. My mother had fainted. That was the first thought that pierced through the shock. Then came the second, I wasn't dreaming. I hadn't misheard. The dean had just told a full auditorium that I, Edna Parker, daughter of a mechanic and a cleaning woman, was now a professor at Harvard. The dean motioned for calm, his hand raised toward the audience. "Please," he said, his voice steady, "everything is under control." I could see staff hurrying to my mother. A woman in a green scarf, a nurse, maybe, was already at her side, gently pressing a cold compress to her forehead. Someone else handed her a bottle of water. My body was screaming to move, to leap off the stage and reach her. But I couldn't, not until I understood what was happening. Dean Langston turned to face me. "Edna," he said more softly, now off mic, "you'll be with her in just a moment. But this moment is also yours." I blinked, trying to speak, but all that came out was a dry breath. Then he stepped back to the mic and addressed the auditorium again. "Some of you may be wondering why this announcement is happening here, now. The answer is simple, because it's historic. Edna's thesis, which I'm sure many of you haven't read yet, has caused nothing short of a quiet revolution within our academic circles. Her approach to modern history, radical, thorough, fiercely original, has opened new intellectual doors." There were murmurs, a few nods, and some expressions of pure disbelief. "It was not an easy decision," he continued. "But it was the right one. For the first time in many years, this institution is not just honoring academic excellence. It is embracing courage, innovation, and merit that rises above legacy." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. My fingers tightened around the rolled parchment I still hadn't unwrapped. Around me, the world continued, but I was stuck between wonder and fear. Had I just been gifted a life I didn't even dare to want? Or had I been shoved into something that would turn me into a target? Behind me, one of the faculty members stepped forward, a woman I recognized from my defense panel. Dr. Ellen Fry. She nodded at me once, warmly, then whispered, "Breathe, Edna. You earned this." The crowd had calmed. Some students even clapped, cautiously at first, then louder. My name was back on their lips, but now with a different tone. Not just as a graduate, but as something else entirely. The rest of the ceremony blurred past. I didn't remember who walked after me. I didn't hear the rest of the names. I was escorted down the stairs, then led toward where my mother sat, now upright, pale but alert. Her eyes met mine, still glassy, and she smiled weakly. I thought I was dreaming, she murmured. Then everything went white. I knelt beside her and held her hand. "You're okay," I whispered. "We're okay." I heard what he said, she added. "Is it true? You're staying?" I nodded slowly. "They want me to teach modern history." She looked at me for a long moment, then exhaled a laugh that turned into tears. Days later, after everything ended and the crowd had dispersed, I was taken to a quiet room behind the main hall. There, the dean and 2 professors waited for me. "Before you leave today," Dean Langston said, "we'd like a word." It wasn't over yet. The office they led me into was quiet and cool, with tall windows that filtered the late afternoon light onto shelves packed with leather-bound books. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure if I was supposed to sit or remain standing. Dean Langston gestured toward the chair across from him, and I lowered myself into it slowly, still feeling like the floor might shift beneath me at any moment. To my left sat Dr. Ellen Fry, the woman who had offered me a reassuring nod during the ceremony. Beside her was Professor Henry Callaway, a stoic man with silver hair and a reputation for never giving praise lightly. The silence between the 3 of them was deliberate, weighty, like they were waiting for me to break it. I didn't. Dean Langston finally spoke. "Edna, I imagine this day has already given you more than enough to process." "That's putting it mildly," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "We owe you an explanation," Dr. Fry said. "And an apology for the way the announcement was made. It was dramatic." I nodded. "That's one word for it." She smiled faintly, then leaned forward. "Your thesis, The Modern Lens, Deconstructing Western Narratives in 20th Century Historiography, was not just brilliant. It was disruptive, in the best way." I blinked, unsure how to respond. Professor Callaway, who had been silent until then, folded his hands on the table. "You challenged established models that even some of us in this room have spent decades defending. But instead of dismissing your work, we were forced to confront it. You didn't just argue against traditions. You reimagined them." I thought back to all the nights I spent writing, redrafting, doubting. To the tiny spiral notebooks I filled while waiting tables during overnight shifts, jotting down fragments of ideas between refills of coffee. I hadn't written that thesis for recognition. I wrote it because I had something to say, and I couldn't bear the idea of being silent. There was a debate, Dean Langston continued. A long one. Some wanted to push your work aside, call it ambitious but premature. Others fought for it. In the end, the provost herself asked to read your thesis. She was moved. She called it, and I quote, "the most original contribution to our department in over a decade." My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. "We had already discussed offering you a fellowship," he added. "But after your defense, and the internal discussions that followed, the decision shifted. You had outgrown the role of a student." I shook my head slowly, not in disagreement but in disbelief. "But I'm 26. I have no PhD. I'm nobody." Professor Callaway raised an eyebrow. "You're Edna Parker. And as of today, that name carries weight here." A silence settled again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was full of consequence. Dr. Fry stood and walked to a small cabinet. She returned with a slim folder and placed it in front of me. "This is the formal offer. Assistant Professor of Modern History." Your teaching responsibilities begin in the fall semester, but we'd like you to spend the summer with us, preparing, meeting faculty, designing your syllabus. And, of course, resting. I stared at the folder. I didn't touch it. My fingers were curled into fists on my lap, trying to absorb what this moment meant. Why me? I asked finally. You could have waited. You could have picked someone with experience. Dean Langston leaned back, his voice softer now. Because sometimes, Edna, when the right voice comes along, we have to stop everything to hear it. I didn't remember much after that. I remember nodding. I remember shaking hands. I remember them congratulating me again, saying they looked forward to working with me. But my mind was already elsewhere, floating outside the walls of that office, across the quad, back to the memory of my mother's hand squeezing mine that morning. When I stepped out of the building, the air smelled like rain, even though the sky was still clear. I looked up at the old brick towers of Harvard and realized they didn't intimidate me anymore. I had just been invited inside. I had spent years mastering the art of invisibility. Not in the literal sense, of course, but in the way people like me learn to survive in places where we weren't expected, let alone invited. I smiled when I was supposed to. I stayed quiet in seminars when others debated with names they had heard around dinner tables their whole lives. I nodded even when I disagreed, kept my opinions in my notebook rather than the classroom. It wasn't shame. It was strategy. No one at Harvard really knew who I was. Not fully. What they saw was a quiet, focused student, punctual, precise, well-read. But they didn't know that I worked 4 nights a week at a diner on the outskirts of Cambridge, pouring coffee until 2 in the morning. They didn't know that I typed most of my early essays in the break room between refilling sugar dispensers and scraping dried ketchup off plastic menus. They didn't know that I walked 40 minutes back to my apartment after every shift, too proud to ask for rides, too broke for Uber, and too wary to ride the late-night train alone. When I got home, I didn't sleep. I studied. I studied on the kitchen floor so I wouldn't wake my mother. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer during my 2nd year. Chemo had turned her bones to glass and her appetite into a battlefield. She insisted I stay at Harvard, and I promised I would. So I went to lectures by day, worked by night, and cared for her in the spaces in between. There were nights she moaned in her sleep from the pain, and I'd sit beside her bed with my laptop open, writing paragraphs in between adjusting her blankets or holding a cold cloth to her forehead. My notebooks were full of crossings out, coffee stains, and pressed petals from the cemetery nearby, a place I walked through when I needed to remember that nothing was guaranteed. I wrote my thesis in pieces, on napkins, receipt backs, borrowed paper. When I finally typed it all out, I didn't think anyone would read it, let alone be moved by it. But I had written it with every part of me. It was my rebellion, my confession, my proof. No one saw the girl who hoarded expired highlighters from the campus lost and found or used public printers late at night to save on ink. No one saw how I cried in bathroom stalls when professors quoted theorists in French without translating, assuming we had all grown up in prep schools. No one saw me carry the weight of my mother's hospital bills while pretending to be fascinated by post-colonial European statecraft. And no one knew about the envelope I kept hidden under the loose floorboard in my apartment. Inside were rejection letters from internships I was overqualified for but underconnected to. One of them had a coffee stain from when my hand trembled too hard to hold the mug straight. I kept them as reminders. Not of failure, but of the game. When people whispered that I was lucky, I smiled. Let them believe in luck. It was easier than explaining the exhaustion, the isolation, the near misses and near breakdowns. Now, with a faculty badge and a folder of official letters in my bag, I felt the walls of that secrecy begin to tremble. I wasn't invisible anymore. But that didn't mean I was safe. Harvard had given me a platform, but platforms were just as easy to fall from as they were to rise on. In the weeks that followed the announcement, I found myself walking different halls. No longer a student, I sat in meetings with faculty members who looked at me with polite curiosity or concealed judgment. Some were kind. Others didn't speak to me at all. I was the name everyone suddenly knew, but I was still the story no one really understood. Sometimes I'd pass students whispering my name, wide-eyed. I'd catch glimpses of my own photo in online articles. The surprise appointment. Harvard's unlikely choice. The headlines always implied a twist. A fluke. But I knew what they didn't. I had fought for every sentence I had ever written. I had endured more nights of hunger and fear than they would ever guess. I hadn't been lucky. I had been relentless. Still, somewhere beneath the recognition, something else was stirring. A feeling I couldn't yet name. As if this opportunity, this moment, wasn't just a reward. It was a test. The applause had faded. The articles were no longer front page. The whispers softened, but they never stopped. As I began my transition from student to faculty, I discovered that Harvard's corridors held more than knowledge. They held tension. Some of it was quiet, buried beneath civility. But I felt it. Like static in the air, just before a storm. At first, it was subtle. Meetings where I was introduced as the new assistant instead of Professor Parker. Faculty gatherings where my ideas were acknowledged with polite smiles but quickly redirected. Comments like, "It's refreshing to have youthful energy around," spoken with a tightness in the jaw that said otherwise. They didn't question my intelligence, not openly. They questioned my place. One morning, I arrived early to a departmental roundtable and found two professors, both tenured, speaking in hushed voices. My name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. The tone was unmistakable. "It's just unprecedented," one of them said. "No doctorate. No fieldwork. No legacy. It sets a difficult precedent." I coughed as I entered the room, pretending not to have heard. They looked up, startled. One smiled too widely. The other nodded stiffly and didn't meet my eyes. But the silence wasn't uniform. Some resented me openly. Chief among them was Professor Alan Whitaker. Alan had been a fixture in the history department for nearly 20 years. He wore tailored suits that never wrinkled and quoted obscure thinkers to end conversations he didn't want to have. He had written 3 books, all of which sat untouched on my shelf, assigned but unread. He was the kind of man who saw history as ownership, something to be guarded by those who understood its weight. From the beginning, Alan treated me like a clerical error. At our first departmental strategy meeting, he referred to my upcoming course as a pilot project. I corrected him gently. "It's a full-credit seminar, Professor Whitaker." He blinked at me and replied, "Yes, of course." Forgive the slip. There were no direct confrontations. No arguments. That would have required acknowledging me as a peer. Instead, he undermined me with precision. Resource requests were overlooked. My classroom assignment was changed 3 times before the semester began, each time to a smaller space. My office phone stopped working for 2 weeks. IT claimed it was a system error. I wasn't so sure. Still, I refused to retreat. I showed up early to meetings. I kept detailed records. I wrote and rewrote my syllabus until it was watertight. I studied the past, not just to teach it, but to defend my future with it. The students, at least, were curious. My name spread quickly among undergraduates, especially among first-generation students, students of color, and anyone who had ever felt peripheral to the academic center. My inbox filled with messages, some eager, some skeptical. One read, "Are you really teaching that class, or is it just your name on it?" Another, "Thank you for being here. We need you." I walked a tightrope. Every smile I gave was deliberate. Every answer, measured. I knew I was being watched, weighed, evaluated not just for my content, but for my composure. One misstep, and the narrative would shift from trailblazer to mistake. Then came the faculty mixer. Held at the home of a senior professor, it was meant to be a casual gathering, a space to build bridges. I wore a navy dress, conservative but sharp, and arrived exactly on time. The house was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, the smell of aged wood and imported wine. I found myself standing near Alan Whitaker, who was deep in conversation with another faculty member. He didn't acknowledge me, not at first. Then, mid-sentence, he turned. "Edna," he said, lifting his glass. "Settling in, I hope?" "Doing my best," I replied, even as I read the sarcasm in his eyes. "Good. I imagine it's quite a leap, from student life to academic leadership. That's not a transition many make so abruptly." I held his gaze. "No, it isn't. But I've always believed in acting when the moment demands it. History tends to reward those who do." There was a pause. Then a smile, a cold, amused one. "Indeed. Let's hope history is kind." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. And I knew then, he wasn't just skeptical. He was waiting for me to fail. The classroom assigned to me wasn't grand. It was tucked in the older wing of the history building, with wooden floors that creaked under every step and windows that stuck when opened too far. But to me, it felt like a kind of altar, sacred not because of where it was, but because of what it represented. That small lecture room, with its mismatched chairs and faded chalkboard, was mine. Not borrowed. Not temporary. Mine. I arrived 2 hours early on the first day of class. I brought my own markers, my own chalk, and a copy of my syllabus printed on thick paper, more out of ritual than necessity. I sat at the edge of the desk, reading over my notes not to memorize them, but to ground myself. The room smelled faintly of old books and lemon-scented polish. I remember breathing in, slowly, as if drawing in courage from the walls. The class was called Modern History Through Personal Revolutions. I had designed it myself. Not chronological. Not Eurocentric. We would start with upheavals, not governments, but lives. We would trace how revolutions began inside people long before they reached borders. The first students trickled in just after 8:40. Some looked curious, others skeptical. A few clearly didn't recognize me and hesitated at the door, checking the room number again. One even asked, "Is this the right place for Professor Parker's seminar?" I nodded, smiled, and said, "Yes, you're exactly where you're supposed to be." By 9 o'clock, the room was full. Every seat taken. Some students sat on the floor near the windows. I stood and closed the door gently, then turned to face them. I didn't open with my credentials. I didn't list my degrees or publications, because I didn't have many. Instead, I told them a story. I want to begin by telling you about a night when I was 19, working the graveyard shift at a diner near Mattapan. It was freezing outside. I had just spilled coffee on myself and was trying to finish a reading on Cold War diplomacy during my break. A man at the counter asked me what I was studying. I told him how nations survive pressure. He laughed and said, "You should be writing about yourself, then." There was a beat of silence. Then a few small smiles. Eyes began to lift. Pens clicked open. Something shifted. "That's what this class is about," I said. "Not just history as events, but as choices. As collisions between who we are and who we're allowed to be." I moved through the lecture with confidence that didn't feel borrowed. I spoke of revolutions, Haitian, Russian, Iranian, and asked them not just what happened, but what it cost. I quoted from memoirs, prison letters, diaries. I challenged them to question the idea of objectivity. History, I said, is always personal to someone. The question is, whose version are you repeating? By the end of the hour, the silence wasn't from boredom. It was the kind of silence that follows realization. Then, someone clapped. I didn't know who started it. Maybe one of the students sitting on the floor. But it spread, genuine, spontaneous. They weren't applauding performance. They were acknowledging presence. I thanked them and reminded them about the first reading assignment. As they filed out, many paused to say something, "Thank you," or "This is going to be different," or simply, "I'm glad I got in." I waited until the last student left, then sat down behind the desk. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the release of it. Later that afternoon, I passed Alan Whitaker in the faculty lounge. He was reading a newspaper, one leg crossed over the other. He didn't look up, but I knew he saw me. I didn't stop. I walked past him with steady steps. That night, I got an email from a student. It said only, "I've never heard anyone talk about history like that. Thank you for seeing us." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "No," I typed. "Thank you for letting me be seen." I had just begun to feel the rhythm of it, teaching, preparing, holding my space. The initial anxiety was giving way to something steadier, like muscle memory forming where there had once only been effort. My students were engaged, the department chair had complimented my course evaluations, and the faculty meetings were, at worst, tolerable. For the first time since my appointment, I exhaled without bracing. That's when the letter appeared. It was a Tuesday morning. I unlocked my office, still balancing a paper cup of black coffee, and saw a single envelope on my desk. No address. No markings. My name was written in block letters across the front, Edna Parker, all uppercase, all deliberate. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and sat. My hands, steady moments before, hesitated. There was something about the envelope's weight, too light, too cold. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of plain paper, typed with no heading or signature. Just 12 words, "You don't belong here." That position should have gone to me. No greeting. No explanation. No punctuation beyond the period at the end. Just that. I read it once. Then again. And again. My heart beat faster, not from fear, but from recognition. It wasn't a surprise. I had felt it for weeks, in the silences, in the looks, in the resistance disguised as oversight. But seeing it written, stark and naked, made it undeniable. I sat for a long time, staring at the words. Not because they hurt. But because they confirmed what I already knew, someone wanted me gone. But who? Alan Whitaker came to mind immediately. He had never made his disdain subtle. But would he really risk leaving something so direct? Too obvious, maybe. Then again, subtlety had never been his strength. Or perhaps it wasn't him at all. Perhaps it was someone I hadn't noticed yet, someone quieter, more calculating. I didn't go to the dean. I didn't forward the letter to HR. I knew how easily these things could be turned against me. I'd seen it before, how complaints made you look unstable, how institutions protected names before people. Instead, I slipped the letter back into the envelope, locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk, and made a decision: I would investigate. Quietly. Carefully. I would learn who had written it, and why. I began by watching. Faculty meetings became more than discussions, they became studies in tone and timing. I tracked who showed up late, who avoided eye contact, who asked probing questions about my curriculum masked as curiosity. I reread emails, noting shifts in language. I marked every moment when the air felt different. At night, I documented everything. A small notebook under my pillow, filled with observations. Not accusations, just patterns. I became a historian of my own present. But I didn't let the fear win. I taught with the same passion. I advised students with the same care. If anything, I leaned in harder. I dressed sharper. Spoke clearer. I refused to shrink. That letter was a threat, but it was also a map. Whoever wrote it had shown me their weakness. They thought I didn't belong. And I was going to prove, day by day, lecture by lecture, idea by idea, that I did. There's something about old paper that tells the truth better than people do. It doesn't shift its tone, doesn't correct itself halfway through a sentence. In the silence of the archives beneath Widener Library, where sunlight barely reached and the air tasted like time, I found myself hunting not just for footnotes and historical insights, but for answers about my own present. Officially, I was preparing a lecture series on forgotten correspondence during global revolutions. I had submitted a request for archived departmental communications, citing research on institutional historiography. It was vague enough to go unquestioned, but pointed enough to get me what I needed. The truth was, I wasn't just looking for the past. I was looking for what had happened behind closed doors before my name was ever called at that graduation ceremony. The anonymous letter still haunted me. Folded perfectly, hidden inside a manila folder under my teaching notes, its 12 words stayed sharp: "You don't belong here." That position should have gone to me. Every day that passed without a second note only made the first more ominous. I knew whoever had written it believed their truth as deeply as I believed mine. So I searched. On the third afternoon underground, after combing through committee minutes and policy drafts, I found a folder misfiled under External Applications, Declined. Inside it, clipped to a summary report, was a letter from Professor Alan Whitaker. It was dated 3 weeks before my appointment was announced. The tone was formal, restrained, but the intent bled through every sentence. In the letter, he strongly endorsed another candidate for the assistant professorship, Dr. Elaine Barrett, a newly minted Ph.D. from Yale. The language was polished, the reasoning deliberate. He emphasized her deep familiarity with traditional research frameworks, her excellent fit within Harvard's academic lineage, and her well-established academic network. Each compliment to her was, in its absence, a dismissal of me. I wasn't even mentioned. Not as competition. Not as consideration. Not as a possibility. Beneath it, stapled to a staff evaluation form, was a handwritten note. At first, I thought it was a margin comment. But as I read, I realized it was something far more honest. The ink had faded, but the words were legible: "If Whitaker gets his way again, we'll never see change. The Parker girl may be raw, but she's the future." Recommending override of traditional protocol. It wasn't signed. But the handwriting matched several memos I'd seen from Professor Lillian Chang, one of the senior figures in the department, a quiet voice with sharp instincts and a reputation for speaking rarely, but precisely. Her note wasn't a defense of me, it was a declaration of war against a system I hadn't even realized I'd disrupted. I copied everything. I scanned the original pages with my phone, folded the copies into my bag, and replaced the documents exactly as I had found them. No trace. No sign I'd been there. As I climbed back to the surface, the weight of what I'd found sat heavy on my chest. This hadn't been an open debate. My appointment had ignited a rupture. On one side, tradition and hierarchy. On the other, urgency and dissent. My name hadn't been floated as a bold innovation, it had been forced through as an exception. And people don't forget exceptions. They resist them. Or they try to erase them. I didn't go straight home. I walked around campus for an hour, letting my thoughts settle. I passed buildings I'd once entered nervously as a student. Now they felt different, less like monuments, more like battlegrounds. Every door had been opened for me with friction. Every title came with an invisible asterisk. That night, in the quiet of my apartment, I opened the drawer where I'd kept the anonymous letter. I laid it beside the copies I'd brought from the archive. Together, they formed a story, someone who believed the system owed them something. Someone who saw my appointment not as earned, but stolen. I couldn't prove who wrote the note. But I now understood the power struggle I had walked into. And I knew one thing with certainty: the letter hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from a place cultivated over decades, protected by people like Alan Whitaker, defended by policies that used words like legacy and fit to disguise bias. This wasn't just about one person who thought they'd been wronged. It was about an institution fighting to keep itself familiar. And I had become the face of disruption. There comes a moment when silence turns from protection to complicity. I had spent weeks watching, collecting, absorbing. I had learned where the fractures in the institution ran, had mapped out the invisible tensions that split offices and hallways into camps. But now I knew enough. I wasn't just a symbol anymore. I was a challenge. And I was ready to meet that challenge head-on. The confrontation wasn't planned. But it wasn't accidental either. It was a Wednesday afternoon. I had just left a seminar discussion on post-colonial revolutions, still carrying a copy of The Wretched of the Earth under my arm, when I saw him in the corridor, Professor Alan Whitaker, standing by the faculty bulletin board, flipping through posted announcements like he was looking for something to disapprove of. His profile was sharp, his posture composed. Every part of him looked polished, practiced. I walked past him without pause. Edna, he said, without turning his head. I stopped. Slowly turned. He was still facing the board. Have a moment? He asked. I didn't reply right away. He finally turned, his eyes settling on mine, not hostile, not warm, just measuring. Always, I said. We stood in silence for a beat too long. Then I gestured down the hallway. Shall we? He followed, and we ended up in a small, empty conference room. I closed the door gently behind us and took the seat closest to the window. He remained standing for a moment before sitting opposite me. I hear your class is drawing strong attendance, he began. It is. Some of the senior faculty are quite impressed. Are you? I asked. He tilted his head slightly. I'm not sure my opinion matters anymore. Oh, I think it does. Especially to the people who still wait for you to speak before deciding how they feel about something. That made him smile, thin and brief. I underestimated you, he admitted. I leaned forward. You erased me. His expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. I read your letter to the hiring committee. Your glowing recommendation for Elaine Barrett. She was the logical choice, he said. Logical? Or comfortable? He looked away. For the first time since I had known him, Alan Whitaker seemed unsure of the next sentence. You don't think I deserved the position, I continued. You believe I was placed here to make a point, not to make a difference. Say it. I think, he said slowly, that you are talented. Ambitious. Passionate. But I also think the Academy is built on a foundation that can't be restructured every time someone writes a compelling thesis. That foundation was built without people like me. Without voices that weren't born into the right homes or the right networks. And now it's your time, is that it? No, I said. Now it's time for all of us. Not just me. For students who never thought they'd belong. For voices we've buried in footnotes. You think history is about preservation. I think it's about excavation. He didn't reply. The silence filled the room like a slow tide. I received an anonymous letter, I said. It said I didn't belong. That the position should have gone to someone else. Alan's jaw tightened. Just slightly. You think I wrote it? He asked. I think you didn't have to. I think you created the kind of space where someone else felt bold enough to. He leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other. You've come a long way, Edna. From scared student to crusader. I stood. I'm not crusading. I'm claiming. He looked up at me. Do you really think you'll last here? Yes, I said without hesitation. Because I'm not asking for permission anymore. I walked to the door, then turned back once. Merritt, Alan. You used to believe in it. Maybe it's time to remember what it looks like when it doesn't come dressed in legacy. When I stepped back into the hallway, the light felt sharper, cleaner. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was clear. Later that evening, I returned to my office and pulled out the anonymous letter once more. I read it for the last time. Then I tore it in half. Then in quarters. Then again. And I threw the pieces away. Not because the threat was gone. But because I had decided it no longer had power over me. The invitation had arrived 2 months earlier, tucked between standard department correspondence and the usual circulars. It was embossed, formal, and came with an itinerary as thick as a novella. The Global Histories Conference, hosted that year at Harvard, was one of the most prestigious academic gatherings in the field. Professors from Oxford, Cambridge, Sorbonne, Tokyo, and Sao Paulo were scheduled to attend. When I read my name on the program, Edna Parker, Assistant Professor, Harvard University, keynote panelist, I thought, for a moment, that it had been sent to me by mistake. It wasn't. Dean Langston himself had nominated me. He later told me that after hearing my first public lecture, he knew the university needed to make a statement, not just internally, but to the world. At first, I hesitated. I knew what that stage represented. It wasn't just prestige, it was exposure. Every word I spoke would be scrutinized. Every pause, every breath. But then I accepted. Not out of ambition. Out of defiance. The day of the conference was crisp, the early morning sun throwing sharp shadows across the quad. I wore a simple black dress with a high collar and deep pockets. In one, I kept a small note I had written the night before: "Speak like the world is listening, even if it isn't ready to hear you." I didn't need it for reference. I needed it to remind myself that this moment wasn't about validation. It was about voice. The main lecture hall was packed. Rows of scholars, students, journalists, and policymakers sat facing a long table draped in crimson cloth. I took my seat between two distinguished academics, Dr. Malcolm Hayes from Oxford and Professor Dalia Navarro from the University of Buenos Aires. They nodded politely. I sensed curiosity behind their restraint. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and walked to the podium. My prepared remarks were tucked into a folder, untouched. I looked out at the crowd. Then I began. "I want to start with a story you won't find in most history textbooks," I said. "It's about a seamstress who never published a paper, never held a title, but who taught her daughter to read by writing grocery lists as essays. Who taught her that resilience is a kind of scholarship." There was a stillness in the room that told me I had their attention. My lecture today is not about what happened in history, but about who gets to decide what matters. For too long, academic history has served as a mirror to itself, reflecting familiar names, familiar voices, familiar bloodlines. But history, real history, is made in the shadows. In kitchens. On picket lines. In whispers and in notebooks that were never meant to be published. I move through examples: revolutions that began in letters, wars that were misunderstood because the stories of the poor, the colonized, the invisible had been left out. I quoted from obscure diaries, from banned books, from voices that had been footnoted out of the mainstream. And then, I paused. There is a difference, I said, between learning history and unlearning silence. By the time I finished, the silence in the room had shifted. It wasn't skeptical anymore. It was reverent. I stepped back from the podium and returned to my seat, my pulse steady. The applause didn't begin all at once. It started in pockets, scattered, hesitant. Then it grew. Louder. Sustained. I heard someone shout, "Bravo!" When I glanced to the side, I saw Professor Navarro clapping with both hands, nodding deeply. Even Dr. Hayes, the embodiment of English reserve, leaned in to whisper, "That was remarkable." But the moment that struck deepest came 10 minutes later. During the break between panels, as attendees milled about the reception hall, a man approached me. He was tall, balding, with a navy scarf around his neck and a leather notebook under one arm. "Professor Parker?" he asked, his accent unmistakably British. "Yes. I'm Richard Altham, Provost of Modern Studies at Oxford. I just wanted to say, your address was not only brilliant, it was necessary. You've shifted the tone of this entire conference. I hope you'll consider collaborating with us in the near future." I nodded, too stunned for words. He smiled, then added, "We need more voices like yours on the international stage." After he left, I stood alone for a moment, letting it sink in. This wasn't just recognition. It was vindication, not of status, but of purpose. The girl who once scribbled notes between wiping counters at the diner was now shaping discourse among the most elite historians in the world. That evening, I returned to my apartment exhausted, but wired. My inbox was flooded with messages: students, colleagues, strangers. Invitations. Praise. Questions. Among them, one from Professor Lillian Chang: "You made history today, Edna. Not just by speaking, but by being heard." I stared at the screen, my eyes burning. And I realized, the conversation had changed. The days that followed the conference were unlike anything I had known. In the halls of Harvard, where once I had felt the need to walk carefully, to measure every gesture, every glance, there was now a quiet shift. Colleagues who had once ignored my presence began to greet me. Some with genuine interest, others with professional calculation, but it didn't matter. The silence had broken. I had stepped out from the margins of their perception. I was no longer a controversy. I was a presence. It was a Friday morning when the unexpected happened. I was walking toward the faculty lounge with a stack of student essays in hand when I saw him, Professor Alan Whitaker, standing alone by the window, staring out over the quad. His reflection met mine in the glass. He turned, as if sensing my approach. "Professor Parker," he said. I stopped. He never used my title before. Just my first name, when he acknowledged me at all. "I was hoping we might speak," he continued. I considered walking past him. I had every right to. But something in his tone, something that resembled restraint rather than superiority, made me pause. "Of course," I said. We stepped into the adjacent reading room, quiet and empty. He didn't sit. "Neither did I. I watched your panel last week," he began. "The entire thing. Twice, actually." "I see," I said carefully. "You were exceptional." I said nothing. "I also read your thesis again," he added, "and the responses to it from the Oxford delegation. They're planning to republish excerpts in the Journal of Contemporary Histories." "I'm aware." He looked at me, but his eyes didn't have the usual distance. They carried weight, but not the kind I had seen before. Not disdain. Not rivalry. Something older. Wearier. I wanted to say that I was wrong. The words were so simple that they startled me. For a long moment, we stood in silence. I let my assumptions guide my judgment. About you. About what you represented. I thought you were a symbol, not a scholar. Symbols can write, I said. Symbols can teach. Yes, he said. And some of them can even forgive. I didn't offer forgiveness. Not yet. Instead, I asked, why now? He hesitated. Then said, because the institution is shifting. And because I don't want to be remembered as the man who stood in the way of it. That, at least, was honest. He extended a hand. I looked at it. Then, slowly, I shook it. Later that day, a memo was circulated within the department. Co-authored by Alan Whitaker and Lillian Chang, it proposed the formation of a new program, Paths to Pedagogy, designed to support and train first-generation scholars and students from underrepresented communities who sought careers in academia. The proposal outlined mentorship models, scholarships, a dedicated advising team, and funding for public scholarship initiatives. It was bold. And it was real. The department met 2 days later to vote on its implementation. The room was packed, unusually full for a mid-semester faculty meeting. When Alan Whitaker rose to speak in support of the proposal, a visible ripple passed through the room. His voice was steady, his words careful. I've long believed in legacy, he said. But legacy means nothing if it excludes the voices that most urgently need to be heard. This proposal, born of Professor Parker's trajectory, offers us a way to rebuild this institution not by erasing its history, but by broadening who gets to write it. The proposal passed unanimously. In the weeks that followed, I began to receive letters. Not from colleagues, not from institutions, but from students. Some were undergraduates I'd never met. Others were high schoolers who had read about lines in whispers and in notebooks that were never meant to be published. I moved through examples, revolutions that began in letters, wars that were misunderstood because the stories of the poor, the colonized, the invisible had been left out. I quoted from obscure diaries, from banned books, from voices that had been footnoted out of the mainstream. And then, I paused. There is a difference, I said, between learning history and unlearning silence. By the time I finished, the silence in the room had shifted. It wasn't skeptical anymore. It was reverent. I stepped back from the podium and returned to my seat, my pulse steady. The applause didn't begin all at once. It started in pockets, scattered, hesitant. Then it grew. Louder. Sustained. I heard someone shout, "Bravo!" When I glanced to the side, I saw Professor Navarro clapping with both hands, nodding deeply. Even Dr. Hayes, the embodiment of English reserve, leaned in to whisper, "That was remarkable." But the moment that struck deepest came 10 minutes later. During the break between panels, as attendees milled about the reception hall, a man approached me. He was tall, balding, with a navy scarf around his neck and a leather notebook under one arm. "Professor Parker?" he asked, his accent unmistakably British. "Yes. I'm Richard Altham, Provost of Modern Studies at Oxford. I just wanted to say, your address was not only brilliant, it was necessary. You've shifted the tone of this entire conference. I hope you'll consider collaborating with us in the near future." I nodded, too stunned for words. He smiled, then added, "We need more voices like yours on the international stage." After he left, I stood alone for a moment, letting it sink in. This wasn't just recognition. It was vindication, not of status, but of purpose. The girl who once scribbled notes between wiping counters at the diner was now shaping discourse among the most elite historians in the world. That evening, I returned to my apartment exhausted, but wired. My inbox was flooded with messages, students, colleagues, strangers. Invitations. Praise. Questions. Among them, one from Professor Lillian Chang, "You made history today, Edna. Not just by speaking, but by being heard." I stared at the screen, my eyes burning. And I realized, the conversation had changed. The days that followed the conference were unlike anything I had known. In the halls of Harvard, where once I had felt the need to walk carefully, to measure every gesture, every glance, there was now a quiet shift. Colleagues who had once ignored my presence began to greet me. Some with genuine interest, others with professional calculation, but it didn't matter. The silence had broken. I had stepped out from the margins of their perception. I was no longer a controversy. I was a presence. It was a Friday morning when the unexpected happened. I was walking toward the faculty lounge with a stack of student essays in hand when I saw him, Professor Alan Whitaker, standing alone by the window, staring out over the quad. His reflection met mine in the glass. He turned, as if sensing my approach. "Professor Parker," he said. I stopped. He never used my title before. Just my first name, when he acknowledged me at all. "I was hoping we might speak," he continued. I considered walking past him. I had every right to. But something in his tone, something that resembled restraint rather than superiority, made me pause. "Of course," I said. We stepped into the adjacent reading room, quiet and empty. He didn't sit. "Neither did I. I watched your panel last week," he began. "The entire thing. Twice, actually." "I see," I said carefully. "You were exceptional." I said nothing. "I also read your thesis again," he added, "and the responses to it from the Oxford delegation. They're planning to republish excerpts in the Journal of Contemporary Histories." "I'm aware." He looked at me, but his eyes didn't have the usual distance. They carried weight, but not the kind I had seen before. Not disdain. Not rivalry. Something older. Wearier. I wanted to say that I was wrong. The words were so simple that they startled me. For a long moment, we stood in silence. I let my assumptions guide my judgment. About you. About what you represented. I thought you were a symbol, not a scholar. Symbols can write, I said. Symbols can teach. Yes, he said. And some of them can even forgive. I didn't offer forgiveness. Not yet. Instead, I asked, why now? He hesitated. Then said, because the institution is shifting. And because I don't want to be remembered as the man who stood in the way of it. That, at least, was honest. He extended a hand. I looked at it. Then, slowly, I shook it. Later that day, a memo was circulated within the department. Co-authored by Alan Whitaker and Lillian Chang, it proposed the formation of a new program, Paths to Pedagogy, designed to support and train first-generation scholars and students from underrepresented communities who sought careers in academia. The proposal outlined mentorship models, scholarships, a dedicated advising team, and funding for public scholarship initiatives. It was bold. And it was real. The department met 2 days later to vote on its implementation. The room was packed, unusually full for a mid-semester faculty meeting. When Alan Whitaker rose to speak in support of the proposal, a visible ripple passed through the room. His voice was steady, his words careful. "I've long believed in legacy," he said. "But legacy means nothing if it excludes the voices that most urgently need to be heard. This proposal, born of Professor Parker's trajectory, offers us a way to rebuild this institution not by erasing its history, but by broadening who gets to write it." The proposal passed unanimously. In the weeks that followed, I began to receive letters. Not from colleagues, not from institutions, but from students. Some were undergraduates I'd never met. Others were high schoolers who had read about